Wallace's article entitled David Lynch Keeps His Head contains a surprisingly candid admission of the extent of Lynch's influence on Wallace's literary and narrative strategies, one that is sometimes mentioned in passing, but has yet to attain the critical currency that I feel it deserves. Look at the quote from the essay. Lynch's heavy Freudian riffs are powerful instead of ridiculous because they're deployed expressionistically, which among other things means they're deployed in an old-fashioned pre-postmodern way, i.e. nakedly, sincerely, without postmodernism, abstraction or irony. This was what was epiphanic for us about Blue Velvet in grad school when we saw it. The movie helped us realise that first-rate experimentalism was a way not to transcend or rebel against the truth, but actually to honour it. Consider this in the context of the earlier comment from the Univis Plurum and the critical positions of basic and critical paraphrasings of the same sentiment. Wallace's landmark novel Infinite Jest deliberately acts out the explosion of what Wallace calls, quote, the delusion that cynicism and naivety are mutually exclusive. A narrative strategy that, in the words of the critic Marshall Boswell, quote, uses irony to disclose what irony has been hiding, to recover a learned form of heartfelt naivety. Wallace's essay on Lynch was written in 1996 on the set of Lynch's film Lost Highway. And I want to argue that, having considered the evident impact of Lynch's narrative strategy on Wallace's literary project and the articulation of it by Wallace in 1996, that there is significant evidence to argue that the change in narrative strategy in Lynch's works, including and after Lost Highway, had a significant influence on Wallace's later fiction, most specifically his short fiction collection Oblivion. Lost Highway is significant in Lynch's canon for initializing a narrative strategy that the director would follow and develop to an elaborate extent in his subsequent films. With the exception of 1999's The Straight Story, which employed a direct linear narrative in an accomplished but almost comically belligerent fashion compared to Lynch's other works, Lynch's films since 1996 have developed narratives that revolve around a conceit laid out in Lost Highway. Lynch's two other feature films since Lost Highway, except in The Straight Story, Mulholland Drive and Inland Empire, form a narrative trilogy of sorts, basically unconnected by a story, but strongly unified by location and symbolic motifs. In Lost Highway, a jazz musician, Fred Madison, kills his wife in a fit of jealous psychosis and is sentenced to death. In prison, he experiences what Lynch calls a, quote, psychogenic fugue. Unable to cope with what he's done, his mind undergoes a delusive transformation, so that his personality changes to that of a completely different person, a virile young man. In the film, the delusion is represented literally, with Fred literally changing in his cell into a man named Pete Dayton. The second half of the film is a representation of Fred's doomed fantasy, in which Pete attempts to save a young woman, played by the same actress as Fred's wife, Patricia Arquette, from a group of pornographer gangsters. In Mulholland Drive, the same idea is developed and the narrative inverted. An initial narrative involving a promising young Hollywood actress, played by Naomi Watts, saving a mystery woman, played by Laura Harron, from a violent conspiracy, is revealed halfway through to be the fevered dream of a failed actress, also played by Watts, who has jealously had a successful actress lover, played by Harron, killed by hitmen. In Inland Empire, by some distance Lynch's most complex narrative, an older actress is making a comeback film, a remake in Hollywood, when she discovers something, quote, inside the story, relating to the original Polish version of the film, which was rumored to have been cursed. A paraphrasing of the narrative of Inland Empire, for any of you who've seen it, throwing hands up, it's virtually impossible, but involves a series of ever more unstable narrative dreams occurring within dreams and films within films, where distinctions between time, identity and place ultimately collapse completely. All three films are set in Los Angeles. It's very unusual for Lynch to set three films in the same place. He's never done that any other time. And becomes steadily more concerned with devoting the process of filmmaking from the peripheral pornography in Lost Highway to the film, within the film narrative in Inland Empire. My analysis will obviously draw most from Lost Highway and Mulholland Drive, as they are the works released within the years before publication of Oblivion, and certainly the stories I'm talking about in Oblivion, and the works in which I will argue that Lynch's narrative strategies develop in the most calculably influential manner. Wallace's short fiction, as opposed to his novels and non-fiction, has always worn its influences very vividly. So Westward, the Course of Empire takes its way, acts as a dramatisation of Wallace's aforementioned thesis for developing fiction beyond postmodernism, and engages very explicitly with Lost in the Funhouse. Brief Interviews with Hideous Men still engages strongly with Barth's postmodern updating of Joyce's mythic and metafiction emotional style, updating the myth of Narcissus and Echo to cable TV syndicates, and in the story Octet, exploring the Barthian metafictional narrative to the limit of both his and the reader's sanity and patience. Wallace's short fiction is traditionally the locus for his discussion of his position within the US literary canon, excepting obviously the big principal essays like Oedipus Plural, with pieces that sometimes resemble thinly fictionalized essays on contemporary literary culture. Oblivion is strikingly different. Gone are the explicit meta-narrative games performed with one eye on the reader and the other on a literary predecessor. Oblivion marks the threshold of a striking new narrative development for Wallace. While still employing his abiding characteristic interests in nesting narratives and unreliable narrators, more than one story strongly employs the motif of the dreaming and waking self as its mediating narrative strategy. Dreams are not a new occurrence in Wallace's work, and a couple of memorable dreams in Infinite Jesters we've just heard, but these function more at the level of implicit character development. Whereas in a number of stories in Oblivion, daydreams, nightmares, and the difference between consciousness and unconsciousness are the central mediating devices. The paring back of overt argument with preceding literary traditions lends the collection a more dramatically vivid and sometimes viscerally disturbing tone. The two stories I intend to look at here, The Soul is Not a Smithy and the title story Oblivion, make explicit use of the motif of dreaming, daydreaming in the former, nightmares in the latter, as a mediating device between a fragile constructed personal world and a traumatic external reality. In The Soul is Not a Smithy, a young boy daydreams a comic book style narrative in wire mesh panels in his classroom window while his substitute teacher suffers a mental breakdown in class, his peripheral awareness of the teacher's behaviour subsequently darkening the tone of the window mesh narrative. In Oblivion, the story, a narrator named Randall discusses in a lengthy monologue how sleep problems are affecting his marriage. But as the narration continues, we become aware through implicit suggestion and a palimpsest narrative that keeps breaking through the main text that some great unspoken trauma lies beneath. In one of the most extraordinary narrative shifts in all of Wallace's work, and frankly in any piece of literature I've ever read, the final lines of the story Oblivion are apparently spoken by a woman emerging from sleep, which suggests that the entire monologue has been dreamt by an unknown female narrator, perhaps Randall's wife, or even maybe his stepdaughter herself. Or maybe someone completely. Both narratives bear striking resemblance to Lynch's scenarios for Lost Highway and Mulholland Drive. A central persona attempts to evade trauma by escaping into a fantastical world that cannot fully sustain the delusion and is penetrated by the external trauma before breaking down. In the strongest narrative connection between Lynch's work and the Oblivion stories, the image of a ringing telephone is employed to suggest an imposition from the waking world forcing its way into the dream or fantasy state. A ringing payphone recurs in Randall's monologue a number of times, most incongruously at the climax of the narrative in Sleep Center, when the real female narrator is on the verge of waking from her dream and terminating the narrative of the story. Similarly, in Mulholland Drive, the image of a ringing telephone by a red lamp occurs within the dream narrative in the first half of the film. Then, when Naomi Watts awakes, revealing the dream status of the previous narrative, Lynch's camera reveals immediately that the same phone and lamp are on the bedside table. The implication being that the imposition of the noise in the waking world has been intruding and threatening the status of their dream. He does the same thing with someone knocking on the door as well. A similar device in Lost Highway, the same jazz music that Fred Madison plays before he murders his wife, suddenly blasts from a radio during his fantasy incarnation as Pete Dayton. Pete is disturbed and immediately turns the radio off, but the fantasy is already beginning to unravel. Interestingly, think about the etymology of the names Pete Dayton and also the transfiguration of Fred's wife. Her name is Alice Wakefield. So Lynch is pretty evasive about these things. It sounds a bit obvious to me. Wallace's use of dreams in Oblivion is remarkably similar. Look at this passage from The Soul is Not a Smithy, where the narrator's window mesh narrative follows some stray dogs being attacked by rats and insects in a sewage pipe. And when I reread this, it is incredibly disturbing, this sequence. The tableau, complete with the unfortunate piebald dog's mouth open in agony and a rat or mutated roach abdomen protruding from his eye socket as the predator's anterior half consumed his eye and inner brain, was so traumatic that the narrative line was immediately stopped and replaced with a neutral view of the pipe's exterior. The lone nightmarish panel appeared in the window as just a momentary peripheral snapshot or flash of a horrifying scene, much the way such single horrible flashes often appear in bad dreams.